So now we're going to look at types of contractions, and this is the muscle responsibility, or the muscle response to input from the nervous system. And contractions always thought about muscle shortening, but it's really an attempt to shorten. And when we look at this muscle tension generation, which is really the premise for how contractions occur, we look at muscle tension, the go signal from the nervous system telling the muscle to do its only job, which is generate tension. And then how much tension is generated is dependent upon how much force, external force there is compared to internal force. So we have three types of contraction, three types of outcomes we're going to look at. We have static and dynamic. Static movements are also referred to as isometric, and there's no visible change in joint angle. Now there might be some micro changes in the muscle length, but we're just going to be looking at the joint angle. The dynamic movements, there's visible change, and these result in either concentric or eccentric. So if the two segments are coming closer together, or they are accelerating greater than gravity, these are concentric. And if the two segments are getting further apart, or the muscle results in a lengthening, this is called eccentric. And so when we look at a squat, we have multiple phases to a lift. There's always an isometric starting point, and the first part of the movement phase, either eccentric or concentric, depending upon starting position. There's an isometric transition from the phases, and then a reposition back to the starting point, and that's one repetition. So in this case, the squat, since we're starting in a standing position, the only way you can go up, the only place to go is down. You can't go up any further. So you start with an isometric with the stop sign, right? And then you initiate your movement and you transition to the eccentric contraction. You go down in the bottom position. You transition, you stop like an isometric. You might only be there for half a second, but it's still an isometric. And then you switch directions and you're going now concentric. So you're going with gravity initially. Your movement is going with gravity. You're moving slower than gravity, so it's an eccentric contraction. And then as you start to get out of the bottom position up, you're overcoming gravity. And so that's a concentric contraction. And then you have a stop sign again. And then either exercise is done or you can continue on with another repetition. So graphically, it looks like this. You start at a peak, you end at a peak, and that's one repetition. The highest you're going to be, the lowest you're going to be, and it can cycle over and over again. And remember, you're starting eccentric because gravity is on the way down, and you're always trying to overcome gravity. So when we look at the three types of muscle contractions, we're looking at this concentric, and the traditional way is to look at it as you're shortening. So you're looking at the joint output, the two bones are getting closer together, and you are shortening. Eccentric contraction, the muscle is lengthening, the two joint segments are getting further apart. And then with isometric contraction, there's no change, there's no visible change in joint output. And you can see these depicted here on the right. So another way of looking at muscle participation or muscle contraction type is to look at the relationship to gravity. Gravity is always in a downward direction. And so if the movement is in the opposition of gravity or overcoming gravity or moving faster than gravity, which would be up in the opposite direction, or accelerating down like throwing something to the ground, that's a concentric contraction. That's green light. If you are moving slower than gravity, so if you drop something and the rate at which it falls to the ground is faster than which your limb is moving, that means that you have some muscle tension being generated that's slowing your fall or slowing the drop. And so that's an eccentric contraction. And if the object is not moving, it's anti-gravity, it's floating in the air, that is an isometric contraction. So it's good to look at this green light, yellow light, red light aspect. The reason is that there are some situations where muscle can be lengthening and it is not in a contraction. So we just saw a couple in the previous video, this agonist-antagonist relationship. As an agonist is contracting, the antagonist is relaxing, but it's also lengthening to allow the movement to occur. So if during that lengthening, there is no muscle tension being generated, thus it's not an eccentric contraction. So solely looking at the lengthening, shortening aspect could be misleading. So I like to look at these things from this acceleration, this braking, or this stopping forces. And it's a better way of looking at it. And it helps us understand and appreciate movement from an analysis perspective, looking at muscle function as its eccentric function instead of its concentric. So when we look at this whole tension relationship in this overcoming or working with gravity, if a concentric contraction is happening, that means the muscle tension being generated is greater than gravity's pull on that mass, than the weight. If the Eccentric contraction is happening. That means the muscle tension is less than gravity. So the gravitational pull on that weight or the segment in the hand is greater than the muscle tension. And if there's no contraction, it's equal tension. So you have three ways of looking at this. You have the concentric as a change in length, acceleration, or joint angle. And again, all are appropriate. Just keep in mind that if you're looking at the length change, that sometimes muscles can change length and it's not a muscle contraction. So you would say, like, where the problem comes is when a test question would be during elbow flexion and you're bending your elbow and the muscle flexors are working concentrically, the tricep of the elbow extensors are working eccentrically. That's just a passive byproduct of movement. That is not a type of contraction. So it's better to look at it from as what's causing the movement, what's controlling the movement, or what's preventing the movement. And I have this flow chart here that helps you kind of delineate between isometric or isotonic, aka concentric, eccentric. But this is important because this leads us into our next conversation, which is muscle involvement. So with muscle involvement, we're looking at not just what joint's moving, what plane of motion it's moving in, or what type of muscle contraction. We want to know who's invited to the party, who's actually participating in that movement. And all muscles are named for their concentric action from anatomical position. So I've used terms like elbow flexors or shoulder extensors or hip flexors or ankle dorsiflexors. If you have a cadaver on a table in anatomical position and you perform joint action, the muscle that would be doing that concentrically in this position, that's how muscles are named. So for instance, in this case, muscles that create the joint are named accordingly. And in this case of elbow flexion, the brachialis is an elbow flexor. You don't want to get in the habit of looking at movement in terms of individual muscle participation. You want to look more in terms of muscle groups, right? So we want to talk in terms of elbow flexors, shoulder extensors, not individual muscles. When you use a term, in this case, like elbow flexors, you are including all the muscles that are involved in the joint action, all the synergists, all the stabilizers, anything that crosses that axis, without excluding the ones that may be obscure. Like in this instance, the wrist flexors can be involved in elbow flexion. If you see elbow flexion and then you say, oh, that's bicep movement, you are exclusive of other movements or other muscles, and you're not looking at the full picture in terms of the movement that's happening. So you look at the movement here, and there are several elbow flexors, and you have to ask the question, which one are you using? And depending upon the level of analysis or the class you're taking, you can list and isolate each muscle, but don't forget, biceps brachii is a biarticulate muscle. It is just as much an elbow flexor as it is a shoulder flexor. And also keep in mind that isolation does not exist in function, aka it doesn't exist in real life. Remember, we're always trying to solve this movement aspect, and the only thing you really can control that is conscious to you is the output, the joint movement. You have no control over muscle recruitment. It can be influenced, like your heart rate, but you can't tell your brachialis to contract harder than your bicep short head. You can't focus and do this silly exercise. No matter how hard you concentrate on that curl, your long head of the biceps can't be encouraged to contract any harder than, say, brachioradialis. Stop doing this exercise. It does not work.